Hello and welcome to Easynomics. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and we are discussing the topic of whether heat waves can impact India's economic growth. And joining me for that discussion is Dr. Ramit Debnath, the Inaugural Cambridge Zero Fellow at the University of Cambridge. He joins us from Cambridge, UK right now. Welcome to the show, Ramit. Let me begin by asking you to explain to our viewers what is this study that you have done and what is the central finding that you have come out with?
Yeah, hi, thank you for bringing me here. So the central study that we did focused on whether the recent heat waves, especially we studied the 2022 April heat wave, which had a huge devastating effect. How much vulnerable was the heat wave to the Indian population? And we also tried to analyze how government or policymakers use India's climate vulnerability or measure climate vulnerability using this metric called Climate Vulnerability Index. And so there was the whole study was designed in a way to understand the complementary benefits of using either one or the other metric and to see the impact.
Okay. What are the conclusions, the key conclusions, if you could sort of bring up the abstract for our viewers?
Yes, so just a foundation or just to help the viewer understand what we talk about this metric. So the government of India uses something called Climate Vulnerability Index or CVI, whereas we also looked at something called heat index. And the heat index is quite special in its way because it actually tells you how a person would feel in that temperature because it have both air temperature and relative humidity within the construction of that metric, if I may say. So that's why what we try to see there is whether the heat waves the impact of heat waves were appropriately captured by CVI or we need to improve the measurement of CVI. And that's why we conclude that using a new form of vulnerability index or mixing both heat index and climate vulnerability index can be actually beneficial in understanding the entire bandwidth of vulnerability that we get from these extreme heat events.
Ramit, your study says that as much as 90% of India's total area now lies in extreme heat danger zones. Break it down for our viewers. What does that mean?
Yes, so the existing climate vulnerability index that government uses also have this category and they categorizes as low, moderate, medium and then danger zones. And similarly within this heat index that we calculate, so it also has that category. So danger means those areas are at high probability of being impacted by the heat waves, and we find it by using the IMD or the weather data from IMD for April 2022.
When you say 90%, would it be fair to assume that the remaining 10% is basically the high mountainous region of the Himalayas, the Kashmir and Himachal and parts of Uttarakhand? Only those will be sort of not in the dangerously hot zones?
One way of looking at this is it's by danger, it does not necessarily mean physical danger from the heat, but rather these areas are at extreme risk of being at the grasp of heat wave. So you are right in a way that remaining 10% are areas like Ladakh that we see, that they are extremely high mountainous zone, although they do have heat waves because of climate change and the temperature is rising, but they are not as intense as compared to some other place in the rest of the country.
Okay. Now let's try and understand the economic impact that you have spoken about. You have said that the increased heat is expected to cost India 2.8% of its GDP by 2050 and an incredible 8.7% by 2100. How did you come up with these numbers?
So these are not our numbers. These are already existing prediction studies that have been done by researchers in other field, and also I think there is a McKinsey report as well, the productivity loss due to heat wave. So so we base our understanding based on building on these literature that was available. But one thing that we could see, and due to this extreme heat impact, is that a lot of working hours, especially outdoors, is going to be impacted. And I mean, I could say it even now that because as I speak with my family back home in Kolkata, and they do also feel this extreme heat, and often I get this complaint that we can't go outside, we can't walk during the daytime. So this is a very real and I mean real lived experience of this extreme heat that will also affect productivity in a very large scale.
Uh, Before I ask you further questions on the economic impact, I just want to dial back and try and get from you, for our viewers, the reasons for these extreme heat events that are taking place. Last April was, of course, something that all of us faced here in India, and this month too we have seen a much more earlier advanced summer than usually.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the challenge also from a vulnerability point, these recurrent and shifting patterns of heat waves and also extreme weather events. So we just talk about heat wave, but also same with flooding or tropical cyclones. This changing pattern is quite, uh, I mean, it's quite worrying because we need to also keep up with how we measure these vulnerabilities. And by that, I mean how we are exposed to this extreme weather events, what is the sensitivity to this across different groups and socio-economic sectors. So coming up with a more holistic measure is that we also advocate in this study.
Is India at more risk than other countries, because climate is something that impacts every human across the entire globe?
Yes, so the answer is twofold. I would say first is yes, India is definitely at higher risk in certain cases because of how our socio-economic structure is as well. We have huge I mean we have huge proportion of low-income populations which are already vulnerable, and especially low-lying areas because of our geography as well. So those physical risks do matter in the overall kind of climate vulnerability, and that also makes us quite vulnerable, and that's why we do see this recurrence of extreme weather events quite often, and it's getting more intense over time.
Uh, how intense is it likely to become in the future? Just last year's 49% as a record event. What kind of increase are we likely to see in the years ahead?
So I don't have an exact number, but I could refer to the IPCC recent report that do say that these are going to be quite extensive, and especially some say I don't have the exact source, but occurrence of twice a term of heat wave in a single year is highly likely in near future because of if we don't meet the Paris Agreement targets.
What needs to be done to mitigate this? I imagine some amount of mitigation is possible, but climate works at a planetary level, and
Yeah.
therefore individual countries' mitigation also have limitations inbuilt. That's why combating climate change is a global challenge, not just for India, one would imagine, Ramit.
Absolutely. So I would definitely say that India has done a lot in setting up the mitigation plans and as well as preparing very detailed study for UNFCCC as the mitigation and adaptation plans. But specific to the heat wave, I would like to say one is understanding the urban vulnerability is quite critical, and that's why we also scale down in our study to understand urban sustainability. And that is quite critical because heat waves are especially vulnerable to low income communities who don't have access to expensive cooling devices or energy intensive cooling devices, and I would say ACs or even cooler at some point. So, and also the urban structure creates these urban heat island effects and they have their local increase in temperature as well. So there is this optimization that needs to be made between both design of how we are planning our urban spaces and provisioning of these basic services to extremely vulnerable population in the cities.
Okay, it is quite obvious to understand the reasons because of rapid urbanization, and you are correct in pointing out that urbanization is not has extracts a greater cost on those who don't have access to higher resources. But you also say that the government is failing to measure heat stress. Explain that statement.
Yes, so that statement stems from again the existing CVI framework, and that do not have a physical risk indicator for heat waves. And one reason being it's based on this IPCC's SREX framework that forms the foundation of the CVI index. But heat waves are quite recent and recurrent. So that's one point that I think that's why we also point out that it's quite timely that we need to come up with a new measure or even potential of integrating a heat measure in the CVI in some form.
What would a new measure do, assuming that your research would strike a chord in policy planning circles and the changes that you suggest are accepted in some form? What would that lead to?
Yes, so definitely one immediate action is aligning this with the heat action plans that are being drawn across different states. And that's why we also have the case study of Delhi, because they had a very intensive and quite expensive heat action, state heat action plan recently, and Ahmedabad as well, which are very good examples to follow. But one thing that we also say that we need to have some form of holistic indicators that talks about the, because one challenge with India is we are so diverse, and that's why capturing the entire bandwidth of those challenges is itself quite a big challenge, and that needs more clearer understanding.
Are there any examples that you could share with our viewers, if you are aware of them, where country-specific, state-specific measures have led to the key thing, which is reducing or at least holding off the increase that everyone is projecting?
Yeah, one thing that's I have seen also during the last UK heat wave, which was quite extent. I mean, that was first time in many years of histories. Was also the measure. Especially, they also used a form of heat index, and that was quite extensively communicated with the citizens through mobile phone SMSs or through news media or through even social media. That when is the right time to go out, and as well as what steps can you take if you feel heat stressed or show the symptoms of heat stroke. So that's as a very kind of a population level. I do see those kind of awareness exercise are very important, especially to make a kind of awareness among the citizens. And same example I could give from Australia, who also have a very intensive heat action plans, especially because their countries also faces a lot of forest fires as well because of the heat. So there are a lot of examples to actually look at and try to bring in those knowledge, and that's why we say about this partnership, forming both international and really regional partnerships to fight the heat waves.
Ramit, what is the challenge for Indian companies and manufacturing companies, service companies, the whole industrial complex in our country? What kind of challenge are they likely to witness, and what should they be doing at their level?
Yes, so definitely a big challenge. So we could break down it into three broad categories. One being physical challenge, that the effect of supply chain because of heat waves. So how is there any mitigation strategies in place to affect the supply chain? The second is more social factors, which are very core to labor and productivity. If people can't work in this extreme heat, so that means the productivity is definitely affected in that. And the third part is the direct impact on the economic. So do we have financial mechanisms or kind of rebound effect already in place to absorb some of these shocks that might come from this disruption due to something like heat waves or increasing temperatures?
All right, this is a very, very important study that you have come up with clearly something that impacts all of us, every single Indian who gets impacted by extreme heat. And we have seen over the years that the summers tend to get hotter, they are getting longer, and they are definitely in the north of India, where I am, they this time around have started earlier than usual, and something that's happened in the past as well. Ramit Debnath, thank you very much for your time with us to talk
Thank you.
about the key findings of your latest study. Can heat waves dent India's economy and the growth potential that we have, and what needs to be done to somehow prevent the worst of this happening? If you've been, thank you very much for watching.